I'm Rabbi Jessica Graf, joined by Rabbi George Altshuler here at Congregation Shereth Israel, and we are delighted to have our guest, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is the director of Truah, an organization that works on social justice issues in the United States and Israel, as our first guest for this series. We're so happy to have you, Jill, and recognizing too that it's 3 hours later for you. So thank you, especially for being awake for us. I want to say to everybody out there, thank you for joining us. We have quite a lot of people who will be with us tonight as they begin to sign on. And I want to say that this was designed as a series to challenge us. The point of this series, called In Focus, Israel, Gaza, is to bring ideas and viewpoints about current events in Israel and Gaza with the Palestinian people and the Israeli people, and to figure out some of the issues that we should be thinking about. We really hope that this series will bring many ideas that you haven't thought of, that we all haven't thought of, and that will open dialogue and discussion at our Shabbat tables, in the car, in our communities, wherever we go, as we really consider and struggle with how to come to some kind of understanding of what the next steps are with Israel and Gaza. So we'd like to invite the people who are with us tonight to feel free to submit questions to the hosts through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And we will be able to submit those to Rabbi Jacobs to ask her some of these questions and to fold them into our conversation. So welcome to everybody who's here.
Wonderful. And I have the privilege of asking the first question, Rabbi Jacobs. So our first question for you is, what do you think the next couple months of the conflict will look like? So that's the first part. And the second part is, what do you hope the next couple months of the conflict will look like?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I just want to say it's really nice to be here, even not in person. So thank you to Rabbi Zimmerman, Graf, and Rabbi Altshuler for inviting me, and everybody at Shereth Israel. And I'm excited to be part of this series. It sounds like there's going to be a lot of really good discussions. Okay, so what I think the next few months are going to look like, I am not a fortune teller, so I'm not going to try to predict, but I will put out maybe some questions that are really live, and I can talk about what I hope will happen, which again may or may not be what actually happens. But some of the questions, well, here are a few of the most live questions. The first question is about the hostages. There's I would say a real question about the soul of Israel that's happening right now. The question is Israel going to make hard concessions in order to save the hostages who are still alive, or is the government going to make the choice to essentially sacrifice the hostages for the purpose of continuing this war? And it's not a strategic choice. It's really a choice about the very nature of the state. There's basically a promise that Israel has always made, which is that its first priority is to protect Jews, and that there's an assumption that, until this point, hostages were soldiers, because until this point, we didn't really imagine that there would be a situation in which children and civilians would be taken as hostage. But there was an assumption that if you were a soldier and if you were taken hostage, that the state would do basically everything to redeem you, because that was a commitment that the state of Israel made to its citizens. And we saw that, of course, in the case of Gilad Shalit, where the state was willing to trade more than 1,000 Palestinians who were imprisoned for him. And now we're seeing the state likely make a very different choice. I'll say there's many Pidyon Shvuim, the redemption of captives, is unfortunately something that Jews have had to think about for many, many times over the course of history. It's a situation that's happened many times in the course of history. I think many of us noticed even that first day that we didn't have to look beyond the Sidurim that we were holding, that the Siddur, at least the classical Siddur, has a prayer for hostages printed in it because we keep needing it. And, there's been many debates over history about how far to go to redeem hostages, how much to pay, what to do. And for the most part, the tradition says that we go very far in redeeming hostages. And there's one really important tshuva, or legal response, by Ovadia Yosef, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, one of the most important rabbinic figures, where he basically walks through and he says, look, yes, we have to go very, very far to redeem hostages. And yes, there's this other opinion that says don't pay too much because you could encourage it, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, but like at the end of the day, essentially, I'm not going to remember the exact language he uses, but he basically says, if a soldier who's going into battle, like they have to believe that the state is going, that if they're taken hostage, that the state is going to have to redeem them, because if they stop believing that, then that essentially destroys the entire morale of this of the army. But I would extend it to the citizens, and that is one of the big things that's happening right now. It seems that the government is likely going to sacrifice the lives of the people who have been taken hostage, and you see the families out there calling for anything to be done, and you see major protests saying do everything for the hostages and also bring down the government. So that's one of the big, really moral choices, and if the decision is to sacrifice their lives, that's going to have I would say, a real stain on the society for many years to come. The second question is, of course, what to do about this war. I just want to say straight up that Israel was 100% justified in defending itself following the horrific atrocities of October 7th. But there's a difference between the right to defend oneself, the right to take military action, and this particular war that's being fought right now. And this particular war that's being fought right now has to end. It's a war that has already killed more than 27,000 Palestinians, destroyed much of Gaza. People are at risk of starvation. I think 1.7 million people are displaced from their homes. There's, just rampant disease, and also has killed already hundreds of Israeli soldiers, and that's going to keep happening. So it's, again, I want to separate between, is military action justified, and is this war that's currently being fought the war that should be fought? And the answer to that is no. And so the real question is whether Israel will do the right thing and move into negotiations about a ceasefire, which of course has to include first the release of hostages. It has to include an end of hostilities on both sides, so both Israeli attacks in Gaza, missile attacks on Israel from Gaza, and there has to be a real plan for rebuilding. And of course, this is Netanyahu's primary interest is to keep his own career alive, and he knows that as soon as the war ends, he does not have any time really left as prime minister. And so that's a big choice. What is more important, saving the lives of both Palestinians and Israelis, or keeping Netanyahu's prime minister career alive? I don't think that's an actual choice, but this government is likely to make the wrong choice. And so that's very, very scary. So again, I'm not going to make any predictions, but my hope is that very soon there will be a negotiated agreement that whatever hostages, God willing, are still alive will be able to come back. There will be an end to hostilities, and then the international community has to move in and come up with a real plan for post-war Gaza.
So can you talk a little bit about what you think that will look like? Meaning, when the war ends, what should we prioritize? What has to happen first in order to begin a process of rebuilding?
Yeah. Again, I'm not going to say what I think will happen, but
good. What should happen? But you hope
should happen. So one is there has to be a real international commitment to two states, to saying that we are not going to just have the rhetoric of two states, but not actually do anything to move it forward anymore. But the United States, the EU, the Gulf states, every party that has any influence has to actually commit to two states and to pushing Israel toward two states. Again, Bibi is not interested in two states. He's interested in maintaining what was the status quo on October 6th. And so moving toward two states has to mean a number of really concrete steps. So one, there has to be some kind of Marshall Plan for Gaza. The whole area has to be rebuilt. It's been destroyed. There has to be a plan for some kind of for a new government, the parties can work out exactly what that is. Is it a renewed PA under different leadership? Is it some kind of intervention by the other Arab states? They have to work out what exactly that's going to look like, but there has to be a new and functional government for Gaza. Certainly there cannot be Israeli reoccupation of Gaza, and there absolutely cannot be settlements built in Gaza. And there has to be a commitment from the United States. The United States should recognize a Palestinian state side by side with Israel. That would be a big, not only symbolic step, but a real step toward making that possible. And then there have to be real steps by the international community to seriously move toward two states, which includes stopping the growth of settlements in the West Bank. As everybody's been looking at Gaza, the West Bank has been on fire with violence by settlers, with settlers pushing Palestinians out of, I believe, 15 or 16 villages. So there has to be actual work on the ground, investments on the ground to move us closer to two states, because we cannot go back to October 6th and go back to a status quo that we know is unsustainable from all sides.
So I just want to ask a follow-up question to that someone just wrote in. What do we do with Hamas and ceding power to enable this vision to take place? What do you imagine that might be able to look like?
Yeah, I mean, this again is going to be a negotiation among all of the parties who are involved. And I'm not going to say exactly which government should be there. It certainly can't be Hamas. And so whatever plan, I mean, Hamas cannot be in charge of Gaza. Again, we can't go back to October 6th. So whether it's the US and the Gulf states and the PA and whoever figuring out a way to have a strengthened PA in there, whether it's some kind of international coalition, they all need to figure that out. But certainly it's not about, let's go back to October 6th and Hamas can just take over again.
I found it very interesting that in your first answer, you talked about the hostages, and also sort of the humanitarian concern of the civilian death toll and casualty toll in Gaza. And my sense is that the Israeli public is more concerned with the hostages, and the American public, including some of the American Jewish community, tends to be more concerned with the humanitarian concerns. And I'm wondering if you see that same divide and if you see a way to sort of bridge that divide.
Sure. Well, first of all, Israelis are not necessarily seeing what we're seeing. So, of course, Israelis have access to the exact same internet we have access to, the exact same social media. But if you are in Israel and you're reading Israeli news, or you're turning on the TV at night and watching the news, you are not going to see the situation in Gaza. You're not going to see images from Gaza. You're not going to see the death and destruction. It's just not present in Israeli media the way that it's present here. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that Israeli society is in trauma. Everybody has lost somebody, or knows somebody, or is 1 degree removed from somebody who's lost somebody, or who's been taken hostage. People, originally, now many of the reservists have been returned home, but originally more than 300,000 people were called up. So that's so many families who are just terrified every single day that they're going to get the knock on the door that nobody wants to get. You have more than 100,000 people who have been displaced from their homes, either in the south or in the north, right? This is a society that's in trauma. And also, there has not been, it's not like there was time really to grieve. I'm thinking about, there's a lot of comparisons to September 11th in the United States, and there's, of course, a lot of differences. But if we remember September 11th, after September 11th, there wasn't a war right away, right? There was time that was just about sitting in our grief. And here, Israel moved directly from the atrocities of October 7th directly into a war. And of course, this is also in a context of a society that has been in in upheaval for the last year since the election of this government, and has been deeply divided and has had, protests every week, more than every week for most of years. So this is a society that's been in upheaval, had the worst tragedy in its history, and then went straight to a war. And so it's not actually that surprising psychologically that for Israelis, it is still October 8th, right? For Israelis, that's where it is. And I think for much of the world who's sitting here and looking at the images from Gaza and is not sitting that immediate trauma and is able to maybe see a little bit of a broader picture, we are really horrified by the death and destruction in Gaza. And like I said, I mean, many Israelis are looking at it in social media, and you have, of course, the civil society sector and the human rights sector that is speaking about it. But Israelis, when they're turning on the news, are not seeing the images that we're seeing.
So from a true perspective, right, looking at the human rights issues that you so diligently continue to work on and think about, and help us all to think about what you were looking at kind of pre-October 7th. And now, can you tell us a little bit about sort of how that's changed and what you envision for a new Israel? You're saying that it's still October 8th in Israel, and the trauma is still so fresh, and it's hard to imagine kind of the rebuilding of a society there. But a new Israel has to come out of this. We can't go back. What does that look like from your perspective, maybe, and what do you hope for? Not predict, but in terms of the way that we re-envision Israel, the way that we are thinking through a trua lens or through kind of a social justice lens about what we do when we finally get out of October 8th.
Well, I think the last year in Israel is really instructive. I was in Israel just maybe 2 weeks after the election, so a year ago, November, and I remember everybody was in deep depression. Every single person I talked to just said, it's over, the country's over, I have to figure out how to leave, just like really, really deep depression. And then just a couple months later, the protests started, and it was something extraordinary and really unpredicted that the entire country, well, not the entire country, but like 20% of the country took part in protests, right? So just imagine, it's as if there were, I don't know, 60 million Americans, if I did that math right, who were out on the street every Saturday night, plus often other days in between, for basically most of a year. I mean, it's unbelievable. During the Women's March, we had, 1 million people on the street. This is just, and that was one day, right? This is just was really unprecedented. And that meant that for much of the year also, Israelis were getting a real lesson in civics. You had political science professors who were giving classes on the streets. You had people who were learning about democracy and learning the details of lawmaking who had never taken part in a protest ever in their lives. And you also had an increased awareness of occupation. Now, the protests were not about occupation. They were not focused on the situation of Palestinians for the most part. There were exceptions. They were mostly focused on Israeli democracy, but you saw people be able to start to connect the dots. And so one particularly important moment was, if you remember, after there was a pogrom in Hawara, in an Arab village, where several hundred, I think about 400 settlers went in and ransacked the village and just attacked residents, and like with total impunity. And the next Saturday night, soon after that, there was an incident in which police officers in Tel Aviv were riding on horseback and attacking protesters, and the protesters just started chanting, "Eifo hayitem b'Hawara?" Where were you in Hawara? And that was a moment of connecting that the country was shutting down democratic protest, but there was no attempt to stop violent attacks inside of the West Bank. And so people were starting to connect those dots. Now, of course, October 7th, of course, was a complete shock to the system. And like I said, people are still in trauma. And it also revealed more of the weaknesses of the government. It's really clear to everybody in Israel, certainly, and hopefully to us here as well, that the same extremists, the same incompetent extremists who are just self-involved and interested in their own political careers and their own settlement agenda, who were in charge on October 6th, were the ones who let this happen on October 7th because they weren't paying attention to intelligence, because army units had been moved to the West Bank to protect settlers, because they were just so involved in their coup on democracy that they weren't paying attention to the needs of Israelis and the safety of Israelis, right? And then they have carried out this war that has no strategy and no plan, and also pursued many personal projects along the way. I would say many attempts to push forward the erosion of democracy. And so that fact is not lost on Israelis, which is why we're starting to see protests against the government and calls for new elections immediately. And so we see a real awareness inside of Israeli society that what has been is not working, and a real awareness of a real desire to rebuild a democratic society. The other thing that we've seen that's just been really unbelievable is already on October 8th or even on October 7th, that we saw the entire infrastructure that was built around the protest movement immediately switch to relief. So all of the relationships and the WhatsApp groups and everything moved directly into feeding people and housing people and getting volunteers to volunteer psychologists and volunteer everything. None of that was the government, because the government can't function. And so the entire civil society is now being run by volunteers, which is extraordinary. And it's extraordinary in terms of a society that came together to protest for democracy and now is coming together to take care of itself, where the government is completely not functional. And so I think the best case scenario is that there can be a new Israel that's built on that, and a new Israel that's built on that commitment to democracy and that commitment to one another, that is committed to bringing in a new government, God willing, soon when this government falls, that is committed to the well-being of Israelis. And like I said, even though it's hard for Israelis to think about Palestinians and to think about occupation right now, those connections were being made. And I think more and more Israelis also are understanding that the previous status quo of basically containing Hamas obviously didn't work. And the Netanyahu plan of essentially strengthening Hamas and weakening the PA, because it worked better for him to have Hamas as an opponent politically, that obviously was a massive, massive mistake. And so Israelis are understanding that, and hopefully will move also toward a place of understanding that the only way to have real security, the only way people in the South and in the North can go back to their homes and sleep well at night is if there's a Palestinian state next to Israel. Like that's the only possibility. There can't be a possibility of moving forward, continuing an occupation, continuing the status quo, and thinking that there can be any safety, security, or freedom for either Israelis or Palestinians.
So Rabbi Graf asked about sort of what Israel will emerge out of this when, God willing, the war ends. I'm curious what you see in terms of the Palestinian side. What are the general dynamics you're looking at, and what are your concerns and hopes emerging out of the Palestinian side when the immediate conflict ends?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an analyst of Palestinian society. I'm not deep in Palestinian society. I'm not going to try to make any claims about it. I think the question is, what is the world community going to do? And is there going to be a commitment from the US and other partners to really invest in making and in ensuring that there can be a Palestinian state that is sustainable, that's rebuilt, and that is really going to be a challenge for the US and the EU and the Arab states, and also for Israel to Israel, well, maybe not Netanyahu, but previous Israeli leaders have put a lot of lip service toward two states, but to really allow it to happen.
Can you talk a little bit about Trua's message with regard to how Americans can respond to this? What should the role of American Jewry be? And what does your organization feel that our role is?
Sure. Well, let me just say a word about Trua. So Trua is an organization that represents American and Canadian rabbis. We have about 2,300 members in 47 states and 5 provinces in Canada. And our work is on human rights. We're a rabbinic human rights organization. And so we work on human rights both here at home and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So not going to talk about our US work for now, but I'll say that it's on immigration, incarceration, worker justice, and democracy. And then in Israel, we work for 2 states. We work to end the occupation. We work for democracy. So that's what Shura does, and we do that through organizing rabbis, through training rabbis, through providing materials, giving rabbis the skills that they need to work with their own communities, whether that's synagogues or schools or camps or other kinds of communities that rabbis are in. So that's kind of a snapshot. But this is what I want to say about the American, both general American, but really the American Jewish community, which is that very often we hear, those of us who are more on the left, center left, liberal, wherever you place yourself, hear this critique of how dare you tell Israel what to do, right? It's usually something like, how dare you sit in your comfortable living room in New York or San Francisco and tell Israel what to do, right? You don't live there, you don't send your children to the army there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to say that that is total hypocrisy, because when you actually look at which American Jews are influencing Israel, it is not the left, it's not the center left, it's the right wing. And so just a few small examples. So Sheldon Adelson, Alava Shalom, put millions and millions of dollars into a free newspaper in Israel that is largely responsible for resurrecting Netanyahu's political career and putting him back into the prime minister seat. And you have major Jewish philanthropists, Irving Moskowitz, Ira Rennert, so many more, the Fallick family in Florida, just so many more who have put millions and millions of dollars into building settlements, literally putting facts on the ground that are blocking a 2-state solution. And of course, this is, as Israelis discovered this past year, it's 2 American billionaires from Philadelphia who funded the Kohelet Forum, which is the kind of think tank. The Kohelet Forum is like if you took the Heritage Foundation and ALEC, the state legislature writing organization, and a whole bunch of other right-wing think tanks and put them all together. I don't know, the Federalist Society, like put all those things together and made one organization. They are the ones who came up with this whole plan to take down Israeli democracy, and that was funded by American billionaires. And so it is 100%, or not 100%, but it like for the biggest influence on Israel coming from the US is Jewish and also evangelical on the right, who are putting money into settlements, who are putting money into destroying Israeli democracy. So I just want to say that. So any of us who see ourselves, I don't know, obviously the people on this call, but any of us who are committed to democracy, who are committed to ending occupation and committed to Israel, I think all of those things have to go together, and are committed to building a strong civil society in Israel, who ever get that criticism of don't tell Israel what to do. It's the people on the right who are literally putting facts on the ground that are destroying Israel from the right. So that's the first thing I would say. And of course, we also can have opinions about any country we want. I think many of us have lots of opinions about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, presumably, hopefully, think that it was, absolutely against international human rights and is really a terrifying attack on another country and violation of sovereignty and et cetera, and destabilizing for the world, all the things we can say. Many of us marched against the genocide in Darfur, right? We can go on and on that the entire point of international human rights is to say that what happens in any given country when it comes to human rights is the business of all of us. It's not a domestic concern. So absolutely, we should have our opinions, we should say them loudly, and we also need to put our money where our mouth is. The right is really good at putting their money where their mouth is. I just gave a few examples, and very often the center left, the left, does not do that. Jewish progressive philanthropy funds all sorts of things, many arts institutions and universities, and also non-Jewish secular organizations, social justice organizations, that's all great. But we also, if we care about what Israel's going to be, we also have to fund organizations inside of Israel as well as in the US that are working for the Israel that we want to create.
So I just, before we move on, I want to follow up with another question about Trua. What were you working on in Israel and for the Palestinians on October 6th and before? And what is Trua specifically doing now for Israel, Gaza? What is the focus of your work and what is the tachlis of your work? Like the practical, what do you?
Literally on October 6th, it's really so painful. But on that Friday, Erev, it was Chol Moed Sukkot, Erev Shmini Atzeret here, Erev Simchat Torah there, for those of us who have 2 days. But there was a group of settlers, including one member of Knesset, Tzvi Sukkot, very appropriate name for the season, who went and put up a sukkah in Hawara, that same town that has been the victim of many, many settler attacks, and had a whole gathering and went out and ransacked the town again. And so that day, we were spending a lot of time railing against that and trying to get attention to that, and the fact that Israel was letting settlers go into Hawara. And I remember that we had put out a statement, or talking to press, and and then we closed down before the Chag, and we're thinking already about how to move forward and push on the State Department to take action, the U.S. administration to take action. The following, I guess, a Tuesday, because Monday was a federal holiday, right? We were going to come back and we were going to really go back to working against settler violence. Of course, October 7th then happened. So a lot of our work before October 7th was very much on working toward 2 states, which means working against occupation. And a lot of that work was about, I hinted at this before, but was about the flow of American money into the settlements. So something that we have been working on for close to, I guess, about 8 years, since 2015. That's now actually, I think there's some new really exciting developments, is trying to stop US money from going to violent settlers. So there's a few American foundations that send money to organizations in Israel that are directly involved in incitement and violence. And I'm not just talking about organizations building settlements, though that of course also, but organizations like infamously Lahava, which is an Israeli organization that has a history of just beating up Palestinians and left-wing Israelis, so organizations that are fomenting violence. So we have been pushing on the IRS to look into some of these organizations that are connected to terror and violence. We've been pushing on Jewish foundations, like Jewish Communal Fund in New York, for example, to put up red lines around violence. Actually, the San Francisco Jewish Community Foundation does have red lines around violence and has stopped the funding has not allowed donor advised fund to go to some of these violent organizations, which is fantastic. We've been trying to push the Jewish Communal Fund in New York to do the same. So we've been pushing really hard on that. We also ran a campaign a number of years ago to get JNF USA to be transparent about where their money is going and how much of it was going into the settlements. And we won that. They actually now are transparent and money is going to the settlements, so thankfully less than before. So that's some of the work that we were doing before October 7th. I'll get back to that also in 1 second. And then also in the last year, we were doing a lot of work around democracy and working with Israeli expats in US cities to organize protests for democracy in Israel outside of consulates and the embassy. And in September, when Netanyahu and various other MKs were in town, we were doing just protests really every day for, I don't know, most of a month. And bringing that American Jewish voice together with the Israeli voice to stand with the Israelis who had been on the street for a year. So that was a lot of our last year. I know it feels like 100 years ago, though that work is still very much relevant. But I actually just want to go back to the question of US funding, because on last week, President Biden signed an executive order that says that essentially places sanctions on certain settlers who have been involved in violence in the West Bank. For now, it's 4 people who have been named, though that is likely to grow. And it's really an opening to shut off some of the money that's coming from the US to support some of the violence in Israel, and actually to shut off some of the money from Israel also to these settlers. So these 4 settlers, all of them have been ringleaders of some of the attacks on Palestinian villages in the West Bank. If they have any US assets, then they're cut off from them. They probably don't have any US assets, but really crucially, it means that Israeli banks also have to comply. So Bank Leumi, I think it's called like the postal bank or something like that, Bank Hapoalim, it means that they are no longer going to be able to access their accounts or get mortgages. Of course, mortgages are one of the ways in which you are able to extend settlements. So it's really, really significant, and we hope that it will be extended to other ringleaders and other even more prominent figures. So that is something that we're going to continue to be working on, because it is, the more that there's violence in the West Bank, first of all, it's destabilizing. The last thing, even if you're only thinking about this just from Israel's perspective, the last thing that Israel needs is for the West Bank to be up in flames. It's also, of course, a massive violation of human rights when Palestinians are literally chased out of their homes, as they have been in 15 or 16 villages. I think 10 Palestinians were killed in these violent attacks in 2023. So it's a violation of their safety, their lives, dignity, of human rights. It's really a threat to all of Israel to have another front open up. And of course, it's a threat to any possibility of long-term peace if you have the extension of settlements, if you have Palestinians chased out of their homes, if you have facts that are put onto the ground that prevent the establishment of 2 states.
So to continue the line of questioning about your role as the head of Truah, as someone who goes out and talks to American rabbis a lot, I'm curious where you see the American Jewish community in all its diversity around this, and whether you've seen shifts in the American Jewish community's views recently as the war has gone on.
Sure. Well, the American Jewish community, surprise, surprise, we don't all agree with each other. We don't necessarily even agree with ourselves some of the time, many of us. So the American community is in many places. I think you all know that, being in the Bay Area, well, any place, but I think particularly in the Bay Area. So the American Jewish community ranges from 100% supportive of this war continuing for as long as it has to continue, to people who have been protesting for ceasefire and for an end to US aid to Israel since October 8th, right? So that is quite a large range. I want to say that where the majority of the American Jewish community, first of all, is still very connected to Israel. We see that in the polling. The majority American Jewish community certainly is connected to Israel, feels strongly about long-term future for Israel. The majority of the American Jewish community, there's not new polling on this, but certainly in the most recently available polling from the last few years, the majority of the American Jewish community is for 2 states, opposed to occupation, does not like Netanyahu, thinks you can criticize Israel and still care about Israel, right? Which we criticize America all the time, and we live here, right? This isn't actually hard. So that's where the majority of the American Jewish community is. So we have seen that in the polling since October 7th. And I will say that what I hear from rabbis in the field and from American Jews in the field is there is a shift. So on October 7th and October 8th and beyond, we were, first of all, in shock. So many of us have relationships, friends, family members in Israel. Many American Jews directly lost people or were 1 or 2 degrees removed from people who lost people. And so there is that shock and maybe secondary trauma that many of us have felt. There was broad support in most of the American Jewish community, certainly the rabbinic community, for Israel to take military action, and an understanding that there was going to be military action, that is what any country would do after an attack like the one that Hamas carried out. And but then it shifted, as I said before. There's a difference between do you support military action in the theoretical, and do you support this war the way it's happening right now? And increasingly, certainly in the last couple of months, I've heard from rabbis, I won't say across the board, but I would say from a very large swath of the kind of conservative, reform, reconstructionist, liberal Orthodox rabbinate, a growing discomfort with this particular war, the way it's being carried out, and a growing understanding that there needs to be negotiations to bring this particular war to an end, because we're looking at more than 27,000 Palestinians who have been killed. And, as I said, 500,000 people who are at risk of starvation. And we're also seeing more Israeli soldiers coming home in caskets. And the day that a few weeks ago, can't remember exactly when I think 21 or 22 soldiers were killed in a single day, that was really a reminder that, a horrible, tragic reminder that the longer that this war goes on, first of all, more Palestinians are going to be killed. Also, more Israelis are going to be killed. Hamas is not going to be destroyed through this military action. The tunnels are not going to be destroyed. There's no possibility that Israel is going to root out every last terrorist, every last gun, every last missile, every last tunnel. Or in order to do that, the price would be, I think, beyond what most of us could possibly bear. And of course, it would turn Israel into a pariah state. And just the price of trying to do what would actually need to be done to eradicate Hamas would be way too high. And of course, you don't eradicate Hamas, right? You could kill every single person connected to Hamas and every single person in Gaza, but there's a generation that is going to see their parents and their family be killed that could turn back to terror. So I think we see a really growing discomfort and an understanding that this war needs to end if we're going to bring back the hostages, if we're going to stop the death rate in Gaza, if we're going to keep Israelis and Palestinians safe for the long run.
So I know that you mainly work with rabbis, but from your perspective, working with all of these rabbis around the country and in Canada, what do you think that American Jews, or let me say North American Jews, can do in this moment to help bring about more justice and more stability in the region, as people far away? And you've talked a bit about kind of the financial ways that organizations can support and fund things that we don't necessarily want to support and fund, but what can we as individuals do? And I want to add to that question a really great question that Leslie Rabin, one of our congregants, wrote in, and to add to her question a little bit, even as I ask it, her question was, how do you envision the Palestinian people having a voice and agency in the post-war situation? And I want to ask you, as part of what American Jews can do to help bring about justice, what are ways that we can help to give more empowerment, more voice to a reasonable Palestinian government that will be able to be a partner with us in figuring out how to have a peaceful resolution to this for the long term?
Sure. Okay, so let me go back to the first part of the question. So in terms of what we can do, one thing that we really need to do, we all know there's been so much polarization, and there's an idea out there that you have to pick a side. You can either be for Palestinians or for Israelis, which is just, it's just bizarre, right? That doesn't make any sense. In what other situation, if you looked at some other war anywhere else in the world, would you think that you had to care only about one people or another, right? So first is to put out a very strong voice saying we can actually care about the lives of both Israelis and Palestinians. In fact, we have to, right? There's some 14 million people on that slice of land. Nobody is going anywhere, no matter how much anybody might fantasize about half the people picking up and going elsewhere. Nobody is going anywhere. So they're either going to live together or die together. And I pick the former, and we need to really have that loud voice that's saying we don't have to choose between people, that in fact the human response and the Jewish response that's rooted in the idea that every single person is created b'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, is to say that we want we want a future in which every single person can live in safety and security and dignity, etc. And that voice, again, it's the most logical voice, but it's not out there. And so any way that we can put it out there, whether it's through op-eds, letters to the editor, talking to our friends, that is really, really important. And that brings me to the second piece, that elected officials are hearing from the polls, right? They're hearing from the people who are only talking to them about Israelis, and they're hearing from the people who are only talking to them about Palestinians. And I will say that in our relationships with the offices of members of Congress, something that I've actually heard the staff have actually said is, can you get people to call us and meet with us and talk to us about the humanity of both sides? And I think that's really, really important that elected officials hear that voice. And so to talk to your elected officials, your members of Congress, to say to them, there is a way forward that is about both people, specifically that this is the moment to push forward two states, that and also to give public voice to the humanity of both sides. That is really important. Everybody can pick up the phone every day, write letters, go meet with their elected officials. And then, of course, I mean, I did say before to give money, but really to put our money where our values are. So whether that's giving to Israeli civil society, Israeli human rights groups, about 30 Israeli human rights groups yesterday or the day before put out a big statement calling for a negotiated ceasefire, return of hostages, end of hostilities from both sides. Support those groups. They are besieged from all sides. And it's important to support them, support the American Jewish organizations that reflect your values. Again, because people on the polls are, again, I don't know where everybody on this call is, but I will say from where I sit, people on the polls are putting their money where their values are. And it's important for those of us who care about the humanity of all people to do the same. In terms of the Palestinian voice, again, I can't speak for Palestinians. I'm not a Palestinian, I'm not obviously not Palestinian. I'm not going to try to speak for Palestinians. It's really, it's crucial, of course, that whatever happens in Gaza afterwards is going to be the Palestinians, of course, need to have a voice in who their government is and how it's going to be carried out. But I do want to say that there's been this language for a long time of, well, we want two states, but there's no partner over there. And that is honestly just an excuse. First of all, the Israeli government doesn't really want two states. Netanyahu, who's been prime minister for much of, for the last more than decade, most of it, he certainly has said really clearly that he doesn't want two states. But also, we've seen situations in the past where real leadership is able to push forward peace. So the most obvious example, of course, is Begin and Sadat. Were either of them partners for peace before they actually made peace? No. Begin came out of the Irgun, right? Sadat, right, carried out Yom Kippur War. Like, these were not people who wanted to get together and get together for coffee and they weren't going to be best friends. These were not people who are lifelong peace seekers, but they were people who were able to see that it was better for their countries, it was better for the region if they were able to put that aside and make peace. Sadat, of course, lost his life, was killed because of that. And we have, because the two of them were able to take leadership, we have a peace agreement that's been the most important peace agreement certainly in Israel's history, maybe in the Middle East, that's lasted for half a century, and that is really extraordinary. So that is a long way of saying that we should not wait for some magical, perfect partner to somehow emerge, that Israel needs to be committed with the support of outside states in saying we are ready to actually make peace. We're ready for two states. It's the only way to move forward. And I also want to say something about Zionism. This is also something that really grates at me when there's language from Israel of we don't have a partner. We want peace, but we can't. And like, Zionism is not about waiting for other people to make our history. The entire point of Zionism is to say that for too long, the Jewish people have essentially had our history handed to us, and now we're going to take our history into our own hands. And say that posture of we can't because we don't have a partner is the most anti-Zionist statement that one can make. And the most Zionist thing that one can do is actually say, we don't care what's going on with the other side. We need for there to be two states. We need there to be peace. We're going to do something that feels impossible, just like the state of Israel was impossible, 100 years ago. We're going to do something impossible. We're just going to move forward because that's actually the Zionist position.
My sense is that a few years ago, Trua and other similar organizations like the New Israel Fund were considered to be like the far left of the spectrum. And now there's this growing movement that's even farther to the left of these organizations. And I'm curious what that dynamic is like for you. And going off of that, one of our congregants, Lisa Erberg, asks, how do you suggest responding to the accusation of genocide? So I'm curious, like, what is it like to be seen as more of a center-left organization now?
Yeah, it's very funny. I mean, where you sit, things shift all the time. And, I'm told all sorts of things about where people see Trua, because it very much depends where people sit. But certainly there are organizations that are farther to our left and organizations that don't want Israel to exist at all. Organizations that cross the line actually into anti-Semitism, organizations that, of course, like you said, use words like genocide, and or think that all Israelis should somehow go back to where they came from, as if that were even possible, or yeah, so there's certainly been a shift. And I think part of the reason we've seen that shift is actually because a lot of the mainstream Jewish community really push back at groups like Trua and J Street and New Israel Fund and Americans for Peace Now. And so for years and years, organizations in our sector, there's a group called the Progressive Israel Network. It's about a dozen or so organizations, the ones I named, plus some others. So there was some real pushback at that sector of organizations in the Progressive Israel Network, and saying, like, they're outside the tent, right? Those groups are anti-Israel, et cetera, et cetera. They can't speak in our synagogue. And a voice that said the only way to care about Israel is to support the policies of the Israeli government. And to care about Israel, to support Israel, means to support occupation. And to be a Zionist means to support occupation. And many people, particularly young people, heard those voices and quite reasonably believed them, and grew up with that Israel education that said that if you care about Israel, then you have to believe X, Y, and Z, particularly occupation. And you can't ever criticize Israel. And saw groups like ours just being pushed aside, or didn't even hear those voices at all. And it's not surprising that people who grew up with the message that if you care about Israel, you have to support occupation, look at the occupation and say, well, I don't support that. So obviously so therefore I don't support Israel. And I just, of course I'm biased, but I think that the voices of those of us who are saying, no, you can support Israel. Actually, supporting Israel has to include fighting occupation, just like those of us who care about the future of the United States are fighting all kinds of policies, whether it's around bad immigration policies or bad incarceration policies, right? We're fighting all kinds of policies of any government, this government, the last government, the next government, right? Any government, we're going to fight bad policies because we actually want our country to be better. And that's actually the most pro-American thing that you can do. So the same thing, if you actually care about Israel, you have to fight against certainly occupation, but also other policies. But I think many people, that voice hasn't been loud enough, in part because a lot of the legacy organizations pushed aside and said groups like Trua or J Street or the New Israel Fund were outside of the tent. And that is, I think really tragic. Remind me of the second question you asked.
Genocide. Question was the
Yes.
genocide, yeah.
Yeah, so genocide is the crime of crimes. it is just to, I know probably most of us know what it is, but it is just to give like the one sentence history. It is about destroying another people as a people. So whether through killing, through suppressing language and culture, through other kinds of actions that are aimed as a people, at a people as a people. And of course, the term genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Jewish refugee, who pretty much his entire family was killed during the war and in Lemberg, and he pushed forward this definition of genocide, both because of his experience and also he had previously witnessed the Armenian genocide and was really shaken by that. So it is considered the crime of crime. It is not the only crime against humanity. It is not the only war crime. I think sometimes there's a desire to say that, you know, any war crime is genocide, but there are many different war crimes. Hamas certainly has committed war crimes. Israel likely has committed war crimes that need to be investigated, but not all war crimes are genocide. So genocide is the crime of crimes. It is a very high bar. There has to be not only those actions, but there has to be also intent to destroy another people as a people. So there's a very high burden of proof. And that burden of proof, so I want to say that I do not believe that Israel is committing genocide. I do not believe that Israel set out to destroy the Palestinian people. I think that this war is, again, I think this is a bad war, the way that it's developed, but it started as self-defense, and I would say it has become largely a war of revenge, as well as of keeping Netanyahu's political career alive. But going into a war because of an attack on Israeli soil, or war of revenge is not a justification for war, but it's not the same as going into a war in order to destroy the Palestinian people, right? It's not the same as Hitler trying to destroy the Jewish people. It's not the same as China trying to suppress Uyghur culture and assimilate the Uyghurs into Chinese society, right? So the intent is really crucial. And also, I want to say that it takes a long time to prove genocide. So the ICJ, what they said was, depending on who you talk to, is framed in different ways. But what they did is they were never going to, in that first moment, they were never going to make claims about genocide, right? It would be years and years before there could be any determination of genocide. And so just want to say that there has not been a determination of genocide. I don't believe that there will be. Intent is really important. And also Israel needs to take steps to ensure that we don't even have to consider that there could be, that the claim of genocide could move forward, which means, of course, working to bring the war to an end, ensuring humanitarian relief for Gaza, and ultimately moving toward a place where Palestinians can live safely and securely.
So I'm looking at the time, and at some point you're going to need to go to sleep. I want to thank you for a very brave piece that I think you wrote and published, that I know you wrote and published, that came out in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency's publication on December 21st, which was several weeks before a lot of other people were talking about this, entitled "The Pro-Israel Case for a Negotiated End to the War in Gaza." And I think it was courageous and direct. And now that you're saying so many of the things that are in that piece, it seems as more weeks have gone on that it was such a prescient piece. I mean, you were looking ahead in a way that was so helpful to guide us with your leadership. We will send out a link to this article so that people have a chance to read it tomorrow if they haven't, or to reread it after hearing you. But I just want to thank you for really a brave and a beautiful piece that you wrote, explaining your view on all of this already six, I guess, a little more than 6 weeks ago, as this war has developed.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be with all of you virtually tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi Jacobs. And we're really interested in continuing the conversation. So in that spirit, we will be sending out an email to all the participants of this webinar with some questions and ideas and articles that we can follow up with. And we're really looking forward to continuing this series and continuing this idea of open dialogue and learning on this subject. So thank you so much for getting us off to a wonderful start, Rabbi Jacobs. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good night to everybody. Please take some of the ideas you heard tonight, especially the ones that shook you up, and continue to talk about them. Good night, everybody.